Jake Morrison stood on the metal platform and looked around the huge arena. The floor was made of clear crystal that stretched for miles in every direction. Below the crystal, hot plasma bubbled and glowed like angry fire. Above him, thousands of alien creatures filled the seats, all making different sounds of excitement. Jake was 52 years old and had fought in many wars. His brown hair was going gray, and his face had lines from years of stress and battle. He wore his simple, blue uniform with no weapons or armor. The alien guards had taken everything except his clothes when they captured his ship. 3 days ago, Jake and his crew were flying through space on a peaceful trade mission. Their ship was small and carried medicine and food to distant colonies. They had no weapons because they were not soldiers anymore. Jake thought his fighting days were over. But then the Zephyrian warships surrounded them. The Zephyrians were a proud race that loved to fight and conquer weaker species. Their leader, a tall blue alien with 4 arms, told Jake that his crew would become slaves unless someone could win their tournament. The tournament was simple but deadly. One fighter had to beat all challengers in single combat. If the fighter won every battle, his people would go free. If he lost even once, everyone would become slaves forever. Jake looked at the cage where his crew sat watching. Lisa Grant, his navigation officer, was 28 and had joined his ship only 6 months ago. She was scared but trying to be brave. Pete Collins, the engineer, was an older man who had worked with Jake for 10 years. He kept shaking his head and muttering that this was impossible. The crowd grew louder as the first opponent walked onto the platform. Jake had never seen anything like it before. The creature was 7 feet tall and looked like a giant bug crossed with a bear. It had 4 arms that ended in sharp claws, and its whole body was covered in hard shell-like armor. The alien's name was Thakmor, and he was a champion fighter from the Krex homeworld. Thakmor raised all 4 arms and roared at the crowd. The sound was so loud that Jake felt it in his chest. The alien spectators cheered and screamed with joy. Many of them had bet money that the human would die in the first fight. Jake walked to the weapon table in the center of the platform. There were many strange devices there. Some glowed with energy. Others looked like they could cut through solid rock. Jake picked up a simple metal staff about 6 feet long. It was heavy and well-balanced, like the training weapons he had used as a young soldier. The Zephyrian announcer, a fat purple alien with too many eyes, began to speak. His words were translated into Jake's language by a small device in his ear. "Ladies and gentlemen from across the galaxy," the announcer said, "today we see a pathetic human challenge our greatest warriors. This weak mammal thinks he can face the might of Thakmor, destroyer of champions, killer of the brave." The crowd laughed and made rude noises. Jake ignored them and tested the weight of his staff. He had learned long ago that crowds meant nothing in a real fight. Thakmor stepped forward and spoke in a voice like grinding rocks. "Human, I will make your death quick if you beg for mercy now." Jake looked up at the giant alien. "I appreciate the offer, but I'll pass." This made Thakmor angry. He charged forward with all 4 claws reaching for Jake's throat. The human stepped aside at the last second and let the alien run past him. Thakmor was fast, but he was also heavy and couldn't stop quickly. Jake had fought many different enemies in his 30 years as a soldier. He knew that big opponents usually relied on strength and speed. They expected their enemies to be afraid and make mistakes. But Jake was not afraid. He had been in too many battles to be scared by size alone. Thakmor turned around and attacked, again. This time he was more careful, moving his claws in patterns to block Jake's escape routes. But Jake had studied the alien's movements during the first attack. He noticed that Thakmor always led with his upper right claw and that his shell armor had gaps at the joints. When Thakmor swung his claws, Jake ducked low and swept the staff across the alien's legs. The Krex warrior stumbled but didn't fall. Jake rolled away as the 4 claws smashed into the crystal floor where he had been standing. The crowd grew quieter. They had expected the human to die quickly, but he was still moving and still fighting. Jake changed his strategy. Instead of running away, he moved closer to Thakmor. This confused the alien, who was used to enemies trying to escape his reach. Jake used the staff like a lever, pushing against Thakmor's joints and armor plates to throw the bigger fighter off balance. The battle lasted only a few more minutes. Jake waited for Thakmor to make a big attack, then stepped inside the aliens, reached and struck at a weak point where the neck met the shoulder. The staff hit exactly the right spot, and Thakmor collapsed unconscious. The arena fell completely silent. Nobody moved or spoke for several seconds. Then Jake did something that shocked everyone even more than his victory. He knelt down beside the fallen Krex warrior and checked to make sure he was still breathing. Jake adjusted Thakmor's position so he could breathe better and called for medical help. The crowd began to murmur and whisper. This was not how arena fights usually ended. Winners were supposed to celebrate and mock their defeated enemies. They were not supposed to show care and respect. Jake stood up and helped the medical team carry Thakmor to safety. The Krex warrior was heavy, but Jake supported his share of the weight without complaint. As they reached the medical area, Thakmor opened his eyes and looked at Jake with confusion. "Why do you help me, human?" Thakmor asked weakly. "I tried to kill you," Jake shrugged. "The fight is over. Now you're just someone who needs help." This simple answer spread through the crowd like wildfire. Aliens began talking to each other in dozens of different languages. Most of them had never seen anything like this before. In their cultures, the strong dominated the weak without mercy. Showing kindness to a defeated enemy was considered weakness or madness. But Jake Morrison was neither weak nor mad. He was a veteran who had learned that true strength came from knowing when to fight and when to help. He had seen too much death and suffering to take pleasure in causing more. As Jake walked back to the center of the platform, he noticed that the crowd was looking at him differently. The laughter and mockery were gone, replaced by curiosity and something that might have been respect. The Zephyrian announcer seemed confused by what had happened. He had run hundreds of tournaments, but nothing like this. Finally, he found his voice again. "The human wins the first match," he announced. "Tomorrow he will face his second opponent." Jake nodded and walked toward the exit. As he passed the cage where his crew waited, Lisa Grant reached through the bars to touch his hand. "How did you do that?" she asked. "That thing was twice your size." Jake smiled for the first time since the tournament began. "Experience," he said, "and the fact that being big doesn't always mean being smart." That night, Jake sat alone in his small cell and thought about the battles to come. He knew that each opponent would be stronger and more dangerous than the last, but he also knew that he had something most warriors lacked, the wisdom that came from surviving when everyone expected you to die. The tournament had 16 more fighters waiting for him. Jake closed his eyes and began to plan for tomorrow's battle, knowing that his crew's lives depended on his ability to win them all. The news of Jake's victory traveled faster than anyone expected. Within hours, video recordings of the fight were being sent across the galaxy through the quantum communication network. Aliens on distant worlds stopped their daily activities to watch the strange human who had defeated a Krex champion and then helped him afterward. Jake woke up in his small prison cell to find everything had changed. Guards who had ignored him before now watched him carefully through the bars. Some looked afraid, others seemed curious. The food they brought him was better than yesterday, and they gave him clean water without being asked. His crew noticed the difference too. Lisa Grant was moved to a cell with a window, and Pete Collins received medical attention for a small injury he had gotten during their capture. The Zephyrians were treating them better because their champion was winning. But Jake knew this was only the beginning. He had 15 more fights ahead of him, and each opponent would be more dangerous than the last. The tournament organizers would not want to lose money by making the fights too easy. Captain Helen Ross arrived at the arena that morning. She was a tall woman with gray hair who worked for the Human Diplomatic Service. The Zephyrians had allowed her to come as an official observer, but Jake suspected she was really there to report his death back to Earth. "Commander Morrison," she said when they let her visit his cell, "I've been ordered to negotiate for your crew's release. We can offer the Zephyrians valuable trade agreements." Jake shook his head. "They won't accept. This tournament means too much to them. It's about honor and showing strength to other species. Money won't change their minds." Captain Ross looked worried. Do you understand what you're facing? I've studied the records of past tournaments. No single fighter has ever defeated more than 8 opponents. You need to win 16 matches. I know the odds, Jake said calmly. But my crew didn't ask to be here. They're good people who were just doing their jobs. I won't abandon them. Before Captain Ross could argue further, the guards came to take Jake to the arena. The second day's crowd was much larger than the first. Beings from dozens of different species had traveled great distances to see the human fight. Betting pools on distant worlds had grown to enormous amounts of money. Jake's second opponent was already waiting on the platform. This creature was completely different from Thakmor. It was called Veltar and belonged to a species known as the Nephites. Veltar was thin and tall, about 6 feet in height, with pale blue skin that seemed to shimmer in the arena lights. Most importantly, the alien breathed a different kind of air than humans and wore a special mask connected to a tank on his back. The crowd was excited because Nephites were known for their poisonous touch. Veltar's skin produced acid that could burn through most materials. Anyone who made direct contact with him would be seriously injured or killed. Jake walked to the weapon table and again chose a simple metal staff. The crowd laughed, thinking he was making the same mistake twice. How could a basic weapon help against an opponent he couldn't even touch? But Jake had spent the entire night studying everything he could learn about Nephite biology. The guards had given him access to a computer terminal, probably thinking it wouldn't help him. They were wrong. Nephites came from a world with very different air than Earth. Their breathing equipment was precise and delicate, designed to filter their home planet's atmosphere and convert it to something they could use. The system worked perfectly under normal conditions, but it had weaknesses. Veltar approached slowly, confident in his advantage. "Human," he said through his breathing mask. "You cannot touch me without dying. Surrender now and I will make your death quick." Jake gripped his staff and watched the alien's movements. Veltar was fast and graceful, like a dancer. His acidic skin gleamed as he moved, and small drops of the dangerous liquid fell to the crystal floor, leaving tiny burn marks. The Nephite attacked with long, sweeping movements, trying to get close enough to touch Jake with his poisonous skin. Jake stayed out of reach, using his staff to keep distance between them. The crowd grew restless, expecting more action. But Jake was learning. He watched how Veltar moved, how the breathing apparatus worked, and how the alien's confidence made him careless. Nephites were used to enemies running away in fear. They were not used to opponents who studied them carefully. After several minutes of careful observation, Jake saw his chance. Veltar had grown frustrated with the human's defensive tactics and made a wild grab for the staff. As the alien overextended himself, Jake stepped to the side and made a quick, precise strike. The metal staff hit Veltar's breathing apparatus, not hard enough to break it completely, but enough to damage the delicate filters inside. The alien immediately began to gasp and choke as his air supply became contaminated. Veltar fell to his knees, struggling to breathe. The crowd expected Jake to finish him off, but instead the human did something that shocked everyone again. He dropped his weapon and rushed to help his opponent. Jake had studied Nephite breathing systems during the night. He knew exactly how to adjust the damaged equipment to restore proper airflow. Working quickly, he reset the filters and cleared the blocked tubes. Within seconds, Veltar was breathing normally again. The arena fell silent once more. Jake helped Veltar to his feet and made sure the alien was steady before stepping back. The Nephite stared at him with large, dark eyes full of confusion. "You could have let me die," Veltar said quietly. "Why did you save me?" Jake picked up his staff and walked toward the exit. "Because winning doesn't require killing." This simple statement caused an uproar in the crowd. Aliens began arguing with each other in dozens of languages. Some were angry that Jake had shown mercy again. Others seemed impressed by his actions. A few appeared to be thinking deeply about what they had witnessed. The tournament's owner, Zorth the Magnificent, was not happy. He was a huge, slug-like creature who made money by giving crowds the violence they wanted to see. Merciful fighters were bad for business. This human is making a mockery of our sacred tournament, Zorth complained to his assistants. The crowds want blood, not philosophy lessons. But the crowds were bigger than ever. Word of the unusual human fighter was spreading across the galaxy, faster than anyone had expected. Species that had never heard of humans were suddenly very interested in learning more about them. On the planet Zerion, a council of Krek's elders watched recordings of both fights. These ancient warriors had fought in countless battles and conquered many worlds. They were impressed by Jake's tactical thinking but puzzled by his mercy. This human fights with the skill of a veteran, said the eldest Krex. But he shows compassion to his enemies. How can he be both warrior and healer? Similar conversations were happening on hundreds of worlds. Jake Morrison was challenging basic assumptions about strength and victory that had existed for thousands of years. Back in his cell that night, Jake found a small pile of gifts outside his door. Alien spectators had left food, books, and small tokens of respect. The guards told him that beings from across the galaxy were sending messages of support. Lisa Grant was allowed to visit him for a few minutes. She looked amazed by everything that was happening. "Jake, do you realize what you're doing?" she asked. "You're not just fighting for our freedom anymore. You're changing how entire species think about combat and honor." Jake sat on his simple bed and looked tired. The fights were taking their toll on his aging body, and he knew the opponents would only get stronger. "I'm just trying to keep us alive," he said. "If that changes some minds along the way, maybe that's not a bad thing." Outside his cell window, Jake could see the lights of spacecraft arriving from distant systems. Tomorrow's fight would have the largest audience in the tournament's history. Somewhere among those ships might be his greatest challenge yet. Jake closed his eyes and began to prepare for the third day, knowing that his actions were being watched by billions of beings across the galaxy. He had become more than just a fighter, trying to save his crew. He had become a symbol of something new and different in a universe built on the idea that might makes right. By the fifth day of the tournament, Jake had defeated 12 opponents. Each fight had ended the same way. He would study his enemy, find their weakness, win quickly, and then help them recover. The pattern was becoming famous across the galaxy. Jake's body was getting tired. His right shoulder ached from blocking heavy attacks and his left knee was swollen from all the quick movements. But his mind was still sharp, and his determination never wavered. 3 more fights, and his crew would be free. The arena was now packed beyond its normal limits. Aliens stood in the aisles and hung from the ceiling supports. Outside, millions more watched on giant screens set up around the complex. The tournament had become the most watched event in galactic history. Jake's latest opponent had been a crystal-based life form that could change its body into different shapes. The fight had been difficult because Jake couldn't predict what form the creature would take next. But he noticed that every transformation took energy, and eventually the alien became too tired to continue. Jake had won without throwing a single punch. As Jake returned to his cell that evening, he found the guards looking nervous. They whispered to each other in their own language and kept glancing at him with worried expressions. Something had changed, but Jake didn't know what. The answer came an hour later when the cell door opened. Instead of the usual Zephyrian guards, a figure in a black cloak stepped inside. The creature was tall and moved with perfect silence. Even though Jake couldn't see its face, he felt a chill run down his spine. "I am Kethvar of the Shadowclaw," the figure said in a voice like grinding stone. "I have come to speak with you, human." Jake had heard of the Shadowclaws. They were the most feared species in the galaxy, apex predators who hunted for sport rather than survival. They came from the dark worlds at the edge of known space, and their reputation for cruelty was legendary. Entire star systems paid tribute to avoid their attention. Kethavar pulled back his hood, revealing a face that looked like it had been carved from black marble. His eyes were solid silver with no visible pupils, and his mouth was full of sharp teeth designed for tearing flesh. Long claws extended from his fingertips, each one sharp enough to cut through metal. "I have watched your battles," Kethavar continued. "You fight with skill, but you show mercy to the weak. This puzzles me." Jake stood up slowly, keeping his hands visible. He had learned long ago that predators could sense fear, and showing weakness would only make things worse. "Mercy isn't weakness," Jake said calmly. "It's a choice." Kethvar tilted his head like a hunting bird studying its prey. Explain this choice. Jake thought carefully before answering. When I defeat someone, the fight is over. What happens next is up to me. I can choose to cause more pain or I can choose to help. The choice shows who I really am. The Shadow Claw moved closer, his claws clicking against the metal floor. On my world, the strong devour the weak. This is the natural order. Why do you fight against nature? Because I've seen what happens when the strong have no limits, Jake replied. I've fought in wars where good people died because someone decided their lives didn't matter. I won't be that person. Kethvar studied Jake for a long moment. The human showed no signs of fear, even though he was trapped in a small cell with one of the galaxy's most dangerous predators. This interested Kethvar more than he expected. You speak of choice, but you do not understand true strength, the Shadow Claw said. Tomorrow I will enter the tournament as your final opponent. We shall see if your mercy can save you from someone who shows none. With that, Kethvar pulled his hood back up and left the cell as silently as he had entered. Jake sat back down on his bed and tried to process what had just happened. The Shadow Claws had never participated in arena combat before. They considered such contests beneath them. News of Kethvar's challenge spread through the arena complex within minutes. Aliens who had been planning to leave after tomorrow's scheduled fight suddenly changed their minds. The betting pools closed, because no one was willing to take odds against a Shadow Claw. Captain Ross visited Jake's cell that night, looking more worried than he had ever seen her. This changes everything, she said. The Shadow Claws don't fight for sport, they fight to kill. Kethvar has never left an opponent alive. Jake nodded. I figured as much. We need to contact Earth immediately, Captain Ross continued. This could start a war. If a Shadow Claw kills a human in public, it will send a message to every species in the galaxy that we're weak and defenseless. Maybe, Jake said. Or maybe it will send a different message. Captain Ross stared at him. You can't seriously think you can defeat that thing. Shadow Claws are evolved killers. They're faster, stronger, and more vicious than anything humanity has ever faced. Jake stood up and walked to the small window in his cell. Outside, he could see more ships arriving every hour. The galaxy was watching, waiting to see what would happen when human met Shadow Claw. I've been in a lot of fights, Jake said quietly. Some I won, some I lost, but I learned something important along the way. The outcome isn't always determined by who's strongest or fastest. Sometimes it's determined by who wants it more. What do you want? Captain Ross asked. Jake turned back to face her. I want my crew to go home safely. I want them to see their families again. I want Lisa to finish her studies and Pete to retire to that little farm he's always talking about. That's what I'm fighting for. Captain Ross left shortly after, but Jake couldn't sleep. He spent the night thinking about every battle he had ever fought, every lesson he had learned about combat and survival. The Shadow Claw would be unlike any opponent he had faced before, but Jake had advantages too. As dawn approached, Jake began his usual pre-fight routine. He stretched his tired muscles, ate a simple breakfast, and cleared his mind of everything, except the task ahead. He had survived 30 years of warfare by being prepared, and he wouldn't change his approach now. The guards who came to escort him to the arena were different from the usual ones. These were elite Zephyrian warriors, heavily armed and nervous. They knew that today's fight might end in ways no one could predict. As they walked through the corridors, Jake could hear the crowd outside. The noise was unlike anything from the previous days. This wasn't the excited chatter of spectators hoping to see a good fight. This was the hushed tension of beings who knew they were about to witness something historic. Jake's crew was waiting in their cage as always, but now they were joined by Captain Ross and several other human officials. Lisa Grant pressed against the bars as Jake passed. Come back to us, she called out. We need you to come back. Jake smiled and nodded, but kept walking. He couldn't afford to think about failure now. Everything depended on the next few minutes. The arena had been modified. For today's fight, the crystal platform was smaller, eliminating places to run or hide. Energy barriers surrounded the fighting area to protect the spectators from any stray attacks. In the center of the platform, a single weapon rack held basic tools and simple weapons. Kethvar was already waiting. The Shadowclaw had removed his cloak, revealing a body designed for killing. His muscles moved like liquid under his dark skin, and his silver eyes tracked every movement Jake made. This was a predator in his natural element. Jake walked to the weapon rack and picked up the same metal staff he had used in every previous fight. Kethvar watched this choice with what might have been amusement. "You face death with a stick," the Shadowclaw said. "Is this human wisdom or human foolishness?" Jake tested the weight of the staff and took his position. "I guess we're about to find out." The arena fell completely silent as Jake and Kethvar faced each other on the crystal platform. Even the air recycling system seemed to stop working. Millions of beings across the galaxy held their breath, waiting for the fight to begin. Jake gripped his metal staff and studied his opponent. Kethvar moved like liquid shadow, his body swaying slightly as if he was already in motion. The Shadowclaw's silver eyes never blinked and his claws flexed slowly at his sides. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena, but Jake barely heard the words. His mind was somewhere else, remembering other battles and other enemies. He thought about the siege of Colony 7, where he had held a bunker against impossible odds. He remembered the ambush at Kepler Station, where he had been the only survivor out of 200 soldiers. Each memory brought a lesson. Stay calm under pressure. Watch for patterns in enemy movement. Never give up even when everything seems hopeless. Jake had learned these lessons the hard way, watching friends die and making mistakes that cost lives. Kethvar struck without warning. 1 second, the Shadowclaw was standing 10 feet away. The next, he was beside Jake with claws reaching for the human's throat. Jake barely had time to raise his staff and block the attack. The force of the impact sent vibrations up his arms and made his bones ache, but Jake was already moving. As Kethvar's claws scraped against the metal staff, Jake spun away and put distance between them. The Shadowclaw's speed was incredible, but Jake had faced fast opponents before. Speed without control could be turned into a weakness. Kethvar attacked again, this time coming from a different angle. His claws whistled through the air where Jake's head had been a split second earlier. The Shadowclaw was testing Jake's reflexes, learning how the human moved and reacted. Jake defended carefully, using his staff to deflect attacks, rather than trying to block them directly. He was 52 years old and fighting a creature in its prime. He couldn't match Kethvar's speed or strength, so he had to be smarter. The crowd began to murmur as the fight continued. Many had expected the human to die within seconds, but Jake was still alive and still fighting. Some aliens started to whisper that maybe the human had a chance after all. Kethvar's attacks became more aggressive. He moved like a hunting cat, striking from impossible angles and using his natural stealth abilities to seem to disappear and reappear around Jake. But Jake had fought in dark places before, in tunnels and ruins where enemies could hide anywhere. During the war on Titan Base, Jake had spent 3 days fighting through underground passages filled with enemy soldiers. He had learned to fight by sound and instinct when his eyes couldn't help him. Those skills served him now as Kethvar tried to use darkness and misdirection. Jake's staff connected with something solid, and Kethvar stumbled slightly. It was the first time the Shadowclaw had been touched during the fight. A ripple of excitement ran through the crowd, but Kethvar recovered quickly and pressed his attack with renewed fury. His claws left deep scratches in the crystal platform wherever Jake had been standing. The Shadowclaw was getting frustrated, and frustrated predators made mistakes. Jake remembered fighting the Corvan raiders on the moon of Epsilon 3. The Corvans were brutal fighters who relied on fear and intimidation. But Jake had noticed that when their initial attacks failed, they became angry and careless. He had used that anger against them. Now he tried the same strategy with Kethvar. Instead of just defending, Jake began to counterattack. Not to hurt the Shadowclaw, but to annoy him. Jake would dodge an attack and then tap Kethvar lightly with his staff before moving away. The touches didn't cause damage, but they were insulting to a proud predator. Kethvar's silver eyes began to glow with anger. "You mock me, human," he snarled. "I'm just fighting. Jake replied calmly. Nothing personal. This made Kethvar even angrier. The Shadowclaw abandoned his careful tactics and launched into a series of wild attacks. His claws moved so fast, they were just blurs in the air. But now Jake could predict where they would go. Jake had seen this pattern before during the battle for New Chicago. An enemy commander had become so enraged by the human resistance that he stopped thinking clearly. That commander had made a fatal mistake, and Jake was hoping Kethvar would do the same. The moment came when Kethvar overextended himself on a particularly vicious swipe. The Shadowclaw put all his strength into the attack, expecting to finally connect with the elusive human. But Jake wasn't there. Jake had stepped inside Kethvar's reach, closer than any sane person would get to a Shadowclaw. Before Kethvar could react, Jake drove the end of his staff into a pressure point just below the alien's ribcage. It was a technique he had learned from a martial arts instructor on Mars Colony, a way to temporarily paralyze an opponent without causing permanent damage. Kethvar froze, his body locked in place by the precise strike. He could still breathe and speak, but he couldn't move his arms or legs. The Shadowclaw's eyes went wide with shock, and something that might have been fear. The arena erupted in chaos. Aliens screamed in dozens of languages, some cheering, others protesting that the fight couldn't be over so quickly. Jake stepped back and waited for Kethvar to recover, which would take about 30 seconds. How? Kethvar gasped when he could speak again. How did you know where to strike? Jake leaned on his staff, breathing heavily. The fight had taken more out of him than he wanted to admit. I studied your species' anatomy last night. Shadowclaws have the same nerve clusters as most humanoid races. You're built for killing, but you still have weak points. Kethvar's body began to respond as the paralysis wore off. He flexed his claws experimentally, testing his returning mobility. But instead of attacking again, he did something unexpected. He sat down on the crystal platform and stared at Jake with new respect. You could have killed me, Kethvar said quietly. While I was helpless, you could have struck a fatal blow. Why didn't you? Jake sat down as well, suddenly feeling very tired. Because killing you wouldn't prove anything. The fight was over, when you couldn't defend yourself. But I am your enemy. I came here to kill you and prove human weakness to the galaxy. Jake shook his head. You came here because you were curious about something you didn't understand. That's not the same thing as being an enemy. The crowd had grown quiet again, straining to hear this conversation between human and Shadowclaw. This was not how arena fights were supposed to end. There should have been a clear winner and a clear loser, preferably with lots of blood. Kethvar stood up slowly, his movements careful and controlled. You have shown me something I have never seen before, human. You had the power to destroy me, but you chose mercy instead. This is not weakness as I believed. No, Jake agreed. It's not. The Shadowclaw looked around the arena at the thousands of watching aliens. I came here to prove that might makes right, that the strong naturally rule the weak. But you have proven something else entirely. Kethvar raised his voice so the entire arena could hear him. I declare this human the victor of our combat. He has defeated me not through superior strength, but through superior wisdom. The crowd exploded into noise again, but this time it was different. The sounds weren't just excitement or bloodlust. There was confusion, amazement, and something that might have been hope. Jake stood up and extended his hand to Kethvar. The Shadowclaw looked at the offered hand for a moment, then grasped it in his clawed grip. It was the first time in recorded history that a Shadowclaw had shown respect to another species. As they walked off the platform together, Jake felt the weight of what had just happened. He had not just won a fight. He had changed something fundamental about how the galaxy viewed strength and weakness, predator and prey. But there was still one more fight to go. The next morning, Jake woke up expecting to face his final opponent. According to the tournament rules, he still had one more fight before his crew would be free. But when the guards came to his cell, they looked confused and nervous. There is a problem, the head guard said in broken human language. No more fighters want to face you. Jake sat up on his bed. What do you mean? After seeing you defeat the Shadow Claw, all remaining opponents have withdrawn from the tournament. They say fighting you would bring no honor, only shame. This was unprecedented in the tournament's 1,000-year history. Warriors from across the galaxy had always been eager to prove themselves in the arena, but Jake's victory over Kethvar had changed everything. If a human could defeat the most feared predator in known space through skill and mercy rather than brute force, what did that say about their own fighting methods? Word of the mass withdrawal spread quickly through the arena complex. Aliens who had come to see blood and violence found themselves witnessing something they had never imagined possible. The tournament that was supposed to prove which species was strongest had instead proven that strength meant something different than anyone expected. Zorth the Magnificent was furious. His profitable tournament was ruining his reputation and costing him money. The fat purple alien called an emergency meeting with the arena's governing council. This human has made a mockery of our sacred traditions, Zorth complained to the council members. The crowds came to see warriors fight to the death, not to watch philosophical discussions about mercy and honor. But the council was divided. Some members agreed with Zorth and wanted to change the rules to force the remaining fighters to compete. Others pointed out that by the ancient laws of the tournament, Jake had already won. No opponent meant no fight, and no fight meant victory, by default. The debate continued for hours while Jake waited in his cell. Captain Ross visited him during the delay, bringing news from across the galaxy. You've started something incredible, she told him. Reports are coming in from dozens of worlds. Species that have been at war for centuries are calling for peace. Talks. The Krex Empire has announced they want to learn about human military philosophy. Even the Trade Federation is asking for cultural exchange programs. Jake rubbed his tired shoulders. The fights had taken their toll on his aging body, but his mind was still sharp. All I did was try to save my crew. You did more than that, Captain Ross said. You showed the galaxy that there's another way to be strong. That victory doesn't require cruelty, and that power can be used to protect instead of to destroy. The council's decision came that afternoon. By a narrow vote, they ruled that Jake had won the tournament according to the ancient laws. His crew would be freed immediately, and they would be given safe passage back to human space. But as Jake and his crew prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. Kethvar appeared at the spaceport, no longer wearing his dark cloak. Instead, he wore simple clothes and carried no weapons. Where are you going? Jake asked the Shadow Claw. With you? Kethvar replied. If you will permit it, I wish to learn more about this mercy you speak of. My people have only known the hunt and the kill. Perhaps it is time we learn there are other ways to live. This request shocked everyone present. Shadow Claws never left their dark homeworlds, and they certainly never asked to join other species. But Jake nodded his agreement. Everyone deserves a chance to change, he said. As their ship prepared to depart, delegations from 17 different species requested meetings. They wanted to establish formal diplomatic relations with humanity, to learn about human military tactics and philosophy, and to explore the possibility of peaceful cooperation. Lisa Grant, now free from her cage, stood beside Jake on the ship's bridge as they entered hyperspace. What happens now? She asked. Jake watched the stars stretch into lines of light as they jumped to faster-than-light travel. Now we go home. Pete gets his farm, you finish your studies, and I get to retire like I planned. But what about all those aliens who want to learn from us? What about the diplomatic missions and the cultural exchanges? Jake smiled. That's for younger people to handle. I've done my part. Captain Ross joined them on the bridge, carrying a data pad full of reports. The Galactic Council has called an emergency session. They want to discuss new rules for interspecies conflict resolution. They're calling it the Morrison Doctrine. The what? Jake asked. The idea that disputes should be settled through limited combat between champions with strict rules about protecting the defeated. Several species are already proposing to adopt similar systems. Jake shook his head. They missed the point. The goal isn't to make fighting more civilized. The goal is to avoid fighting altogether. But even as Jake spoke, He knew that change took time. The galaxy had operated on the principle that might makes right for thousands of years. It would take generations to fully embrace the idea that strength could be measured by restraint rather than destruction. During the long journey home, Jake spent time talking with Kethvar about the differences between their species. The Shadow Claw was fascinated by human concepts of honor, duty, and sacrifice for others. In return, he taught Jake about the ancient traditions of his people, many of which had been forgotten in their focus on hunting and killing. "My ancestors were not always predators," Kethvar explained one evening as they sat in the ship's common room. "Long ago, we were guardians who protected weaker species from real threats. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that protecting others is harder than destroying them." Pete Collins, the engineer, had been listening to these conversations with growing interest. "Maybe that's what we all forgot," he said. "Every species in the galaxy seems to think that being strong means being able to hurt others. But the strongest thing Jake did was choosing not to hurt you when he had the chance." When they finally reached Earth, Jake found that news of his victory had arrived ahead of them. The spaceport was crowded with reporters, government officials, and military personnel, all wanting to interview the human who had changed galactic politics with a metal staff and a philosophy of mercy. Jake avoided most of the attention, slipping away to his small apartment while others dealt with the media circus. He was tired and wanted nothing more than to rest and plan his retirement. But even at home, he couldn't escape what had happened. A young reporter managed to find his address and knocked on his door. "Commander Morrison," she said when he answered, "the whole galaxy is calling you a hero. How does it feel to know that you've changed everything?" Jake looked past her at the city skyline, where alien ships now shared the sky with human vessels. Diplomats and traders from dozens of species had come to Earth to establish new relationships based on cooperation rather than conquest. "I don't feel like a hero," Jake said honestly. "Heroes are people who choose to do the right thing even when it's hard. All I did was refuse to become something I didn't want to be." And what was that? Jake thought about all the wars he had fought, all the enemies he had faced, and all the times he could have chosen cruelty over mercy. "A monster," he said finally. "I refuse to become a monster." 6 months later, Jake attended the graduation ceremony where Lisa Grant received her advanced navigation certificate. Pete Collins had bought his farm and was growing vegetables that were apparently popular with 3 different alien species. Even Kethvar had found his place, working with human anthropologists to study the cultural evolution of predator species. As Jake watched Lisa receive her diploma, he thought about how a simple choice to show mercy had rippled across the galaxy. Wars were ending, new alliances were forming, and species that had never considered cooperation were working together on projects that benefited everyone. The galaxy was still a dangerous place, and there were still those who believed that might makes right. But now there was also hope that strength could be used to protect rather than destroy, and that the greatest warriors were those who knew when not to fight. Jake Morrison had won more than a tournament. He had won the future.